Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to reintroduce to you now. Dave Feldman is a returning guest on our show. Check out his first appearance on Boundless Body Radio in episode 109, where he was interviewed by our mutual friend, guest host, Dr. Nick Norwitz. Dave Feldman is a senior software engineer, entrepreneur, and a citizen scientist. After starting a low carbohydrate diet in 2015, Dave found that his cholesterol numbers had increased considerably. He then began reverse engineering the lipid system through self-experimentation and testing, finding the system to be very dynamic and fluid. He has now demonstrated this phenomenon multiple times by moving his cholesterol up and down substantially in a matter of days. He's discovered similar and reproducible patterns in others and has since researched a particular phenotype that he coined lean mass hyperresponder. Dave is the creator of the popular blog Cholesterol Code, where he shares all of his knowledge and research. He is also the founder of the Citizen Science Foundation, a nonprofit that has funded several landmark studies. Dave has recently hosted the incredible collaborative science conference in his hometown of Las Vegas in March of 2024. You can find Dave primarily on Twitter at Real Dave Feldman. Dave Feldman, we're an absolute honor to welcome you back to Boundless Body Radio.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Casey.
It is such an honor to host you. Like I said, it was amazing to have the interview that we did with Nick, and he primarily took point. I'm excited today to be able to ask you a few questions about your history and a few special moments kind of in your life. People that like the musical Hamilton might be thinking of the room where it happened. I think of these different rooms and presentations of, places I've been that I've been able to learn about your research. It's just absolutely special times. And the one that I really want to start with is the most recent one, which is the conference that you just hosted. I know you have gone on a much needed vacation since hosting the conference. I just have to say, what a special event. That was incredibly done. Now that the dust is settled, how are you feeling about how it went?
Oh, I've said this many times. I'll just say it again. It went better than we had business for it to have gone. It was for it being our very first time. I mean, first of all, I have to pass the vast majority of the credit on to Sharon Del Pilar, who is Mrs. Dave Feldman. She crushed it, and to be fair, she is a pro in the business. She's done. She literally works in this field. But that said, she'd never done nor had I ever actually organized a conference. There's of course a lot of moving parts, a lot of people you got to curate and so forth. But there was some things that I always was saying that I'd want to do differently if I were to ever have a conference, and I'm thankful that I was able to hit a bunch of those. For one, I wanted to help other would-be people like myself. I got kind of the chance in 2017. Props to Jeffrey Gerber, who went ahead and put me in like one of the last slots on a Sunday, as low carb Breckenridge was winding down. And it was great because that was my shot to get the research out at that time. And I wanted to provide that kind of opportunity, literally build it into the conference. And so, as you saw, we had not just featured speakers, the speakers you are used to at a lot of low carb conferences, but specifically, we saved a lot of slots for citizen science speakers. And so they had 14 minutes to, give us where their research is, their new insights, their stories, and it was kind of a risk because you don't know. You don't know what they're going to bring. You haven't seen them in other venues necessarily. But I'm gonna humble brag here. I think it went off really great. People really liked all the talks, including the citizen science speakers, and I think it went off. Like I said, it went better than we had any business for it to have gone, given just how new we were to this and how many chances we were taking.
I've asked several people if it felt like the first time that this conference had been held. Universally, everybody was like, no, this feels like a conference that had been held 5 or 6 times. Absolutely love that you use the WOVA app to help set the conference. That helped me to reach out to people before the conference to ask them what their expectations were before going to their very first low carbohydrate conference. Everything went super well. Who were you most impressed with as far as the citizen scientists and the topics they talked about?
Oof, you're asking me to pick one of my favorite children. There was so many good ones. I will go ahead and concede of the ones that were standing out in my mind. Of course, I liked Darius's talk a lot. I loved Matt Bazuki's talk, which is up. The last one I put up was Jessica Apple's. Just phenomenal. I mean, what a, whew, like, get you in the feels, right? Just I really do think that as much as we need to put together the strong data so that we've got it in the literature, we've got those hard numbers, there really is something to be said about that human connection and hearing just one person talk about their whole case and presenting it live and really bringing it forward. And I felt like Jessica exemplified that like so well. She
So
really, really, and she had flown 27 hours to come give that talk. And that is some incredible dedication. And I thought she just killed it. She did fantastic.
yeah, and she's so humble. I talked to her afterwards. She was like, "What do you think I did okay? Like, did I do it right? Like, yes, you did amazing." Like,
Yes.
everybody was talking about it. It was so good. Oh man, we did have one awkward moment. Like me, I was sitting next to our mutual friends of Dobbin. So me, Matt, and Robin, we've done several of these. We were sitting front row, and there was one speaker that went a little bit past his time, and then kept going a little bit past his time, and a little bit past his time. And for us in the audience, that was so awkward. We wanted to just like crawl into our chairs in that moment. Everything else was great. All the other talks were great. The community was excellent. It took me longer than it should have to make the connection because I saw a group of people that were there because of concerns about cholesterol, and then mental health was also this like almost separate thing to me. There's
Hmm.
so many people here for mental health, and then like I realized, well, of course they're all here for the same reasons. They're people like our good friend Robin, who is here because of both reasons. She
Yes.
has to be very low carbohydrate to avoid symptoms of bipolar. And what happens when she does that is a little bit scary, which we'll get into later. But like I realized there was that really cool conjunction between those two worlds.
Yeah, there's to be to be sure, the reason it was called the Collaborative Science Conference and not like the Low Carb Vegas Conference was it was kind of my broader vision. And the one thing that I felt like I could have done more on was I did want to pull in more folks that weren't necessarily specifically low carb. And that was also the case with the citizen science speakers, is I wanted to be sure that it didn't feel too homogenous in one particular direction. But that said, it is absolutely true that a lot of the folks who follow me and follow my work are specifically interested in the cholesterol connection, and that's also why the one panel I wanted to be sure we had was specific to this work, was the LMHR panel. That too went way better than I thought it was going to go. I just that was the most recent video that I put out, and by popular demand, because people kept. I thought I'd be putting it out toward the end of the slate of the different talks, and it's been the most requested. People have been emailing me, but like, when's the panel coming out? When's it coming out? And it's because, of course, it's a hot topic. Is if you are on a low carb diet, and especially if you're on it for efficacious reasons, you have a particular treatment that you're making use of it for. It's not just that you're doing it because it's trendy, but you actually are. You're addressing, like in the case with Robin, you're addressing like bipolar, or you're addressing epilepsy, or you're addressing ulcerative colitis, like Nick Norwitz. You have a particular reason, and there seems to be just this one thing that's through the roof, cholesterol. It's literally what the purpose of the conference was, which kind of helps pull me back around to the literally the purpose of this conference was to raise money. It was a charity event dressed up as a conference, but we are taking all of the dollars raised from attendees straight to the next study, to the sister study for the next endeavor. And it's what's neat is we're helping to prove this model works. It does take a lot of elbow grease, takes a lot of work. And again, I have a saint of a wife that would actually go through all of this and organize all of this and also contribute her time. But that's what can I say? We're going to keep doing it as long as it keeps showing its success.
Well, I haven't talked to anybody who wouldn't come back absolutely to that conference. So again, kudos to you, and well deserved all the praise and the money that you raised and everything. I think the Saturday morning panel was a great place to kind of make this point. it's Saturday morning. It's Vegas. Everybody had traveled there. There was a time change earlier that week, which was kicking everybody's ass anyway. Storms in Vegas wasn't exactly the best,
Yeah.
Vegas weather that weekend, which we can talk about. But like everybody was tired, and it's Saturday morning. We start at 8. This panel's at 9. We're talking about some very technical, complicated things. And I was thinking during the conference, like, I wonder if I could steal Dave to like just have like a soundbite, maybe just ask one question. You were way too busy. There was no chance that was ever going to happen. But the question I was going to ask you was, what did you think about a generally lay audience? People like me, I'm a personal trainer, like people, citizen scientists, and the level of questions they were asking to some very, very smart people on stage. What can you comment about that?
As far as like how well that went, or
The quality of the knowledge and the questions of the people that were attending, the lay people that were just there to learn. Like, were you pretty impressed with how freaking smart they were?
yeah, I was very impressed. It was, you know, I probably I probably would have only tweaked getting the mic out to the audience sooner. The very first question ended up being from David Diamond. You'll see in the video, I actually had sort of the captions over top. That's the only thing that I kind of cringe at, but it it's meaningful to me. One way you can kind of know when something went well, especially like a panel, is if you're re-listening to it. Let's say it came up in your feed or whatever, and you're just like, oh yeah, I did kind of want to hear back on this question, or I want to know what this answer sounded like. And you find you can't stop listening to it. You didn't mean to listen to it for very long. And that was the case with this panel. This panel, I mean, I literally moderated it. And then I edit the video. And then I'm previewing the video just to make sure that the sound quality came all right at the point that I'm launching it. I'm like, yeah, I still want to listen to it. I want to listen to this panel technically in the third time. And I don't have the time. It's so even like speeding it up a little, 1.5 times speed, just the interactions between all three of the panelists. It was extremely professional. It was very articulate. They got into some of the key differences, and I felt like it was well represented. But yeah, to your point, we also got some very interesting questions from the audience. One thing I really appreciate is I did try to set the tone early on that I wanted to keep things very concise and I wanted to run a tight ship. And so, yeah, as you no doubt noticed, in some cases I had to prompt a speaker to wrap up because I was intending to really move us along to really keep as many, because you also want to be fair to the other speakers. You don't want to like encroach on their time as well, right? However, with that, that does mean that, we're taking less time for questions on a per speaker basis unless they give the balance of time to be able to have that happen. But if you're really fair and you set the tone, as I kind of hoped and speculated, then that was the case. In the case with the panel, we did manage to get through a lot of questions. There was a couple of times where I had to kind of crack the whip a little bit, like, we need this to be concise. But everybody was good natured about it. It really did work out.
Yeah, every conference needs a Doug Reynolds to speed up the questions and make sure
Yeah.
inevitably somebody goes into their family history and is asking very personal questions and medical advice. Like, okay, come on. Um, yeah, that's amazing. I wonder if you felt the way I felt when they had Keto Salt Lake City here in 2022. I had nothing to do with putting it on, but being a resident of Salt Lake City, it was a terrible weekend. So I felt like I had to apologize to everybody around for like, usually it's better weather than this. I'm so sorry. It's like rainy and cold. Like, I don't know why I took it on my own personal problem to tell people sorry about the weather, but did you feel a little bit of that? It was a pretty cold and wet
Yeah, that was the running joke is one of my friends at the conference said, uh, he said, they'll do anything to stop you. And we both laughed. But yes, I have lived here, gosh, since 2008, so around 8 years. I honestly cannot think of any time in the entire time that I've been here where there was rain literally preceding the conference. So the conference was Friday, Saturday, and it started Thursday, the day before. And you have to understand, if you live here, it's not that rain is unheard of. It's just it's somewhat rare, and if it comes, it's here for a little bit and then it goes away, right? So you might have like a few hours. You might have some overcast with like some drizzles, but it's not it's like you just wait it out a moment or two and then it's out of here. This was unlike, and that's part of why you saw like some pooling of water in some areas, because of course we don't have a lot of drainage or sewage here in Las Vegas of all places. Um, but yeah, we had like some decent, I mean, it really was reminiscent to me of when I visit Seattle. And so I had to drop that joke a couple times at the conference. I was like, you are in the right city, I promise you. And the next time we do this, I would bet this is the city, this is the city of gambling, but I would definitely bet it's going to be a lot better. The locations we're looking at, by the way, for a possible next conference, have a lot of outdoor capabilities. So
Excellent.
yeah, that'll be, we'll see. And Sharon won't want me to commit to anything, live yet, but
Sure.
once I have an idea, some of the places have some nice possibilities. I'll just put it that way.
Cool.
So of
That sounds
course, I'm
great.
counting on the weather to be better.
Excellent. We're looking forward to that. Sherry, one of the participants at the conference, she won the WOVA, whatever, with the most comments. She was one of the people I interviewed. She traveled from Wisconsin. And as I talked to her like the week before, she's like, I'm just so looking forward to 80 degrees and sun. Like, sorry, didn't happen. That's
Yep.
okay. Next time. Well, you did an amazing job. And like I said, I've been to a lot of these conferences and they're all very good, but this one to me was special. And I think it's one we're going to look back on and say, like, I was there at that first one. So kudos to you. I'm really glad you put it on. I have no idea how much work it takes, but I'm sure it's a lot more than I would ever imagine you probably had thought before you started this endeavor, but really grateful for you. Another kind of related thing you've already mentioned, taking us to a room in Breckenridge. You said it was 2017. I always thought it was 2016. This story is now like low carb legend lore mythery or whatever. Like, tell us about coming into the low carbohydrate space for the first time, and what did you want to communicate with people that very first time you got on stage?
Well, for sure, I wanted to, for a little extra context, the very first conference that I'd ever gone was exactly 1 year earlier, and it was also Jeffrey Gerber's conference, and it was Low Carb Vail at that time. First time the conference was ever held. Um, Jeff will concede a bit of this was also sort of an excuse to have skiing so he could get like,
Of course it
you know,
was.
fellow buddies together and they could be like, oh, and it's a conference and there's CME. Oh, and by the way, we have like 2 hour breaks for outdoor activities of who knows what kind that happen to be in Vail, right?
Interesting.
And when I went there, this was about 3 months in after I'd gotten my blood work and after I had had 8 blood tests where I was showing the inversion pattern. I don't know if you had seen my earlier talks where I'm talking about that. And I'm like, this is it. I'm going to go to this low carb Vail conference in 2016. And I had my laptop. And this is part of the lore is I'm wandering around with my laptop and I'm looking like a crazy maniac engineer guy who's like, you got to see this. You got to see this. Let me explain, blah, blah, blah. And they did not know how to digest what it was that I was saying. But I kept talking to all the folks, including Jeff. And eventually Jeff said, and here's an interesting fun fact to know and tell. On that weekend of low carb Breckenridge 2017, there was also another conference I had originally intended to go to, and it was the National Lipid Association, the major organization that's specifically connected to the science of lipids, which seemed more appropriate for me to bring my data to, at least in my mind at that time, that that would be a place where there'd be a lot greater receptivity. And by that time, I hadn't just had the 8 blood tests, I had 29 blood tests, and I had the energy model, the beginnings of the energy model in hand. And I thought maybe if I just get there, I'll find somebody who will take me on that. Jeff goes, don't bother going to that conference. Come to our conference. I'll give you a slot, toward the end on a Sunday. And yes, when I got there, I wanted to really drive home the point that I don't think can be stated strongly enough, which is that it's not just that that lipid levels move up and down quickly in our body. It's that we just never had this situation before, pretty much since we started doing blood work on lipids, where there was a number of people who would intentionally seek to be powered by fat who were also metabolically healthy. So those two things together. Like Atkins existed before, but Atkins was typically adopted by people who were metabolically challenged. They were like really overweight and they were willing to forego the doctor's advice on saturated fat. But if you were a health nut in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, if you were running, if you were listening to the advice of skip the steak and have a salad, right? And if you're wanting to run, what do you want to do? You want to top off your glycogen stores. You want to do the pasta party with everybody else. Carbs were the way. And saturated fat was, for anybody who just didn't care that much about their health. So here we have the rise of keto right about the time that I'm coming in. And now, as I started writing cholesterol code, I'm sharing my data, other people are sharing it with me. So it was a confluence of many different things that benefited this larger story. Uh, I I benefited from, for example, social media existing for people having this level of interest and for us connecting. But this phenotype, this rise of a group of people who didn't just have marginally higher LDL, but like me, suddenly, boom, we're in the top 1%. And it doesn't follow what we would have thought. Up until that point in time, we would have thought it'd be the person sitting at home, eating food and not getting anything done, not the most metabolically healthy, particularly the leanest folks. Why would they be getting the highest LDL? So when I went on that stage in 2017, I wanted to not just bring the data that I had, but I wanted to leave open some very provocative questions. I wanted to really tantalize people and get them interested in this journey with me to help figure this out. And yeah, at that time, the energy model made the most plausible sense. And much of it's still the case today. It's actually surprising how many of the pillars that I was kind of, building up at that time have kind of made it all the way to our published paper in 2022.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's surprising in a sense, but anything that's true becomes more and more and more true over time. And that certainly has made sense. It seems to tie up things and answer more questions and be really context specific for so many different things. And that definitely has been borne out over time. Maybe now would be a good time to talk a little bit more about the lipid energy model and the lean mass hyperresponder in particular, because we so far been talking about high cholesterol, high LDL cholesterol, but there's other parts of that phenotype that people need to understand and really appreciate. We're not just looking at one thing in isolation. We're looking at a system and a context, which is again why you're such an expert in this field with your engineering mind.
Yeah, yeah. So you hear the term metabolic health constantly, constantly, constantly in this space. But let's kind of break that out a little bit. So metabolism is the counterbalancing between anabolism, which is the building up of stuff, and catabolism, which is the breaking down of stuff. And if you've got good metabolic health, you're good at building stuff up, breaking it down, but in particular in the area of fuel, right? So if you're not going to be fueled as much by carbohydrates, in fact, if you're bringing your carbohydrates down enough, then your liver wisely goes, oh, my present stored glucose is low to the extent that I want to whip up the fat-based energy stores to be releasing at a more rapid rate. So glycogen stores in the liver get low enough. Kind of think of glycogen stores as like maybe the room in your refrigerator, but your fat stores are like 20 walk-in freezers, right? You've got plenty of storage there, but it it takes a little bit more thawing, if you will, right? There that has to be spun up. And your body's pretty quick. It's pretty quick to adapt in that the liver won't allow glycogen to get too low before it has reason enough to start this whole cascade that ultimately results in your fat cells releasing fat at a faster rate. Why? Well, the best way I could put it is your bloodstream is kind of like a buffet, and your body is running this buffet, and so your cells need energy on demand at all times. Well, if you've got less and less glucose being stocked on that buffet, you need to have more fat on that buffet instead, right? Okay, so now more is getting released into the bloodstream, and oxidative tissues can take more advantage of it, where they're not taking care of taking glucose, they can take fat instead. But on top of that, importantly, you need to replete, you need to refill at a faster rate. Those fat cells, those adipocytes, they need to get restored along with more fat fuel going to the oxidative tissues as well. And that's where the liver comes in again, because it's also picking up a lot of that fat that's coming out. It's packaging it onto something called VLDL, very low density lipoproteins. And so the lipid energy model, and here's the part where it starts to get controversial because there's a lot of debate on this part, is we're positing more of the fat's coming into the liver, it's taking up more fat, it's packaging and secreting more of these lipid-rich VLDL, but that's coupled with something else. It's coupled with a faster turnover of these VLDL. So they're barely getting out of the liver before hungry cells are rapidly depleting them of their triglyceride load. And because of that, you end up with both lower triglycerides because of the turnover. And these VLDL, as they're dropping off those lipids, they shrink and become smaller and become the more famous LDL. That explains the higher LDL cholesterol. The cholesterol ride shares with the triglycerides on these VLDL, and therefore you end up with more successive, not just LDL particles, but LDL cholesterol. Lastly is the third component, and it's an important one, but it's a little esoteric, which is the HDL. Why is the HDL cholesterol so high for people like myself and Nick Norwitz and many who are lean mass hyperresponders? Well, because part of that turnover is that as that VLDL is shrinking, it's shedding. It's not just that those lipids are coming off and into cells, but literally its surface components are starting to come apart because when things are getting smaller at that rate, they have to drop off those components. And there are fleets, there are many more HDL particles than there are ApoB lipoproteins in your bloodstream. And they're picking up those surface components, they're picking up the cholesterol esters, and they're forming and becoming larger. So a good way I like to describe it is these ApoB lipoproteins like VLDL, their job is to start large. They have all their cargo from the beginning. And their job is to start large and to get small. Conversely, HDL's job is to come into the bloodstream small and to get large. And it gets large from that turnover. So now let's bring it all the way back to metabolic health. What are the two things we look for that's low-hanging fruit to determine if somebody's metabolically healthy? We look at triglycerides and we look at HDL. So when triglycerides are high, what does that mean? It means poor metabolism because it means they're having trouble putting those triglycerides away. So you've got this fuel that's building up. The buffet line is, it's coming over. And what should be happening is it should be getting put away. So metabolism, in the simplest terms, is an ease of putting fuel away and bringing it back out again. But when it's not getting pulled away because there's a lack of turnover, that also means less that's going into the HDL pool, and therefore HDL is lower. And it flips if you're metabolically healthy. Triglycerides go down, the HDL goes up. So what's interesting about this, where the controversy is that it's very difficult for me, even with advanced lipidologists, to bring to their attention the idea that the lipid energy model is positing a higher secretion rate of these VLDL, these triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, because from their perspective, it's static, that the turnover is the same, whether you're powered by fat or not. And we definitely arguing differently. I'm saying no, the turnover is faster because you are powered by fat. You do have greater turnover. And by the way, this is why it gets all the clues just kind of fall into place. One of my favorite examples is if I was trying to manufacture lean mass hyperresponders, I wouldn't just get people who are lean. I'd get people who run at a higher rate cardio-wise, because your heart muscle cells, cardiomyocytes, They love triglycerides coming off of VLDL. It's because they're a lot of power. They're a lot of ATP yield. A triglyceride is around 460 ATP, whereas a beta hydroxybutyrate is around 22, and a glucose molecule is around 34 to 36, something in that neighborhood. But a triglyceride is three fatty acids with a glycerol backbone. Average-ish is around 460. And a VLDL leaving the cell, guess how much it has on board? How many triglycerides it has on board?
I've heard you say this number before. What, 4,000 or something?
10,000. 10,000. So 10,000 times 460, you've got massive amounts of ATP yield. It makes total sense. And this is why I think it makes sense when they do things like they selectively delete lipoprotein lipase on rodents in rodent models. They have heart failure. They cannot compensate enough with non-triglyceride fuel, with
Wow.
non-ApoB lipoprotein delivered fuel. They need it because that turnover is so crucial.
Interesting. That is super well explained. We've had Dr. Adrian Sotomoto on our show several times as well, and he's explained kind of this next part and how you guys determined the cutoff, or how it was determined. It wasn't really determined by you, according to him. It was kind of a computer model that picked the cutoff, which was very interesting. When we're talking about lean mass hyperresponders, we're talking about these people where we see the greatest elevation in cholesterol with people that are also the leanest. You kind of alluded to it already, but can you explain exactly that correlation, that part of the equation as far as the lean mass hyperresponder?
Yeah, well, and actually, just to finish on your point with Adrian, yeah, this was one of the most exciting things. Is my first go around in working with him was on the LMHR paper. And it was great because I was up front and have been this whole time that the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, those cut points were chosen by me, but from pattern recognition. It wasn't it wasn't that I just kind of went, I think it should just be these. No, it was from me seeing it enough times. And then when Adrian used a machine learning model, the cut points were surprisingly similar to the LMHR cut points, right? I would have been fine, by the way, if it was called something else. If it now it's kind of too much in the zeitgeist, so there's not. I I don't hate that, but by the same token, it is ironic, I guess you could say. So yeah, getting to the leanness component. So we can go back to the very same um, analogy I was using before. If you are stocking a buffet, right, and you're pulling from adipocytes all around your body, your fat cells all around your body. But now your fat mass is lower, so the stores are lower. But your lean mass is higher, so the demand is higher to get to that fat. Well, if I'm like say working out just my right arm over here, right? Am I pulling out fat only in my right arm? What do you think?
I get that question all the time. People want to do as many sit-ups as possible and lose weight around the belly, and unfortunately, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, what can't I just like, get this one arm not only ripped in muscle, but also for the fat to just like go down to like nothing?
One
No.
would hope.
Yeah, the as I like to joke, muscle is very capitalist. Your fat, your adipose tissue, it's very socialist, right? So
Fat.
so you will absolutely build muscle where you put in the work for it. But your fat is broad-based, global, systemic. And so if I'm working out my arm like crazy, the more I'm working out my arm, the more my body is getting the signal to release fat everywhere. And so the adipocytes are getting signals. We won't go into all of them, but there are signals that are sent out. If you get really bored, start looking into A and G PTLs. But I'm going to get your audience glazing their eyes over if I do. I'll just say there are tissue specific um, signals that are saying, hey, release more fat now. But here's the irony. The irony is if you have less fat mass to work with, that means you have to replete it at a faster rate, right? You're pulling more out of storage, sure, and more is getting used by the muscles that are in demand, but that also means that you need to restock them faster. And you can flip that script. What if you have plenty of adipose mass? What if you have lots of fat cells with lots of fat, right? Then you actually don't need to turn up the faucet that much. It doesn't take much, just a little bit of fat coming out. And that's why it makes perfect sense why we wouldn't have seen this phenotype until recently, because those folks who were going from, like, say, a BMI of 33 down to 27, they actually might see their LDL even go down. Why? Because they're getting more metabolically healthy, but they're not actually reaching a level of metabolic health that's typical of where that exchange starts to take shape. And you can actually see that change up, right? Conversely, as you go from, like, say, around a BMI of 24, presuming that it's healthy fat to lean ratio, as you get leaner and leaner, as you get to the Nick Norwitz level, boom, LDL goes higher, 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 higher. And sure enough, when he has published on this before, as he gains weight, his LDL goes down. And it's the same with me as well. I literally went on an experiment in 2018 where I intentionally gained 19 pounds. And my LDL went down to where it was before I went on keto.
Wow. Was this
Yeah.
a different experiment than the white bread and processed meat experiment, or was that the same?
No, it's a different experiment. It was,
Mm,
I want to say it was April into the beginning of May 2018. And
gotcha.
I'd gone on a mixed diet. So that also, I knew these would all pull the levers. But then, yeah, the white bread and processed lean meat was 2.5, 3 months later.
Gotcha.
I'd been keto by that point, and that was kind of like the first iteration.
Yep, gotcha. Okay, thank you for laying the groundwork there. I think that's very, very helpful. And it starts to progress down the road to where you can ask different questions, more interesting questions, things that we all want to know about. What does this pattern mean? And that takes us to kind of where you were conjuring up this study. How could you study this in a way that would be very meaningful to show what you're explaining, but also show that, is this pathological, or is this the way the mechanism is supposed to work? Is this completely normal? And so tell us about how you decided to study this, and what components you thought were most important for that.
Yeah, so to what you're getting to is that you could almost say that there's two questions I've been exploring this whole time. Question number one is the one we mainly talked about just now, which is the mechanistic one, the why. And the why is a great and interesting question. It's also easy for me to do my own N of one experiments to help elucidate and learn about. The second one is the tougher one. It's the risk. Is it, this could even be, I could even be right about this, but is it still risky to just have high LDL? That is not easy. It's easy to understand what the data mean once you have it, but getting the data is very time consuming. It's very expensive. It's very hard. And so in 2017, when I'd written for the first time about the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, uh, I started having some more serious stories reach out to me. You mentioned Robin a little bit earlier, for example. I had really only known a lot of folks who were just kind of in it for the curiosity, but like me, they had the cheat codes. They could, step off of it, maybe not be keto, but be low carb-ish. But then the more that I came across people, particularly children, who had a special reason to be very low carb ketogenic, but had sky high LDL cholesterol, where do they go? What do they do? Because there's no data. There's just no data on risk as it associates. So for 2 years, I tried to go through the quote unquote normal channels. I tried to reach out to actual lipidologists, to cardiologists, to researchers in these fields and be like, let's do this. Let me tell you about these guys. This is a scientific opportunity because up until now, all of the data we've been working from are in clusters. They're in clusters of other cardiovascular risk factors to the degree that we don't know how much one is affecting the others. We just don't know, right? And the lipid energy model kind of hints to why it may be that we're overstating ApoB in its independent causality, and that indeed it may be possible that where LDL and ApoB are increased due to actual metabolic fat adaptation, that it may not have that associated risk, right? But again, over and over again, I would emphasize this is a hypothesis. Don't take it to the bank. Let's just get real data. So finally, 2 years later, after trying to knock down everyone's doors, I took a chance that I'll just say, Casey, I can never say this enough times. I really had no idea. I I'm sure in hindsight, people are just like, oh, Dave just keeps like charging forward with full certainty, and that's how he keeps. No, I really had no clue. And so I started building the Citizen Science Foundation before announcing it, spending a lot of money so that the lawyers would cross the T's and dot the I's, because I knew this. I knew if I was going to do this, I had to go all the way. Because of course, if the data did show that this was a low risk population, then of course it would be highly scrutinized. I would understand it getting highly scrutinized. So we had to do it the right way from day one. So I made it a bona fide public charity, which is not easy. Just telling you. For anybody thinking about doing it, just do GoFundMe unless you really want to go this far. And then I want a Houston stage, Low Carb Houston. Thank you, Dr. Nadir Ali, to make that announcement that I was starting up this charity. I was going to try to raise the money to just do this study ourselves. We'd find a research center. We did in Lundquist. Thank you, Dr. Matt Budoff, for taking it on and being the principal investigator. And yeah, we kicked it off. We would have gotten a lot further, a lot faster, but this whole like pandemic thing came up and it's
Never
really,
heard of it.
yeah, spoiled the party for us. Like rain in Vegas.
Well said. And just to get an understanding of this as well, Matt Budoff, I was not as familiar with him. I know he's a big deal in cardiology. I was not as familiar with him. Is that because he's not necessarily a low carbohydrate guy? He's more in the cardiology space.
Correct. It's interesting because you only get to know these things after being in the space yourself. Even though he is a board certified lipidologist, he's very much a scan researcher. Like he's so deep into CT angiography and coronary artery calcification going way, way back. I mean, like 30 years ago back. And he was perfect in so many respects because he didn't really have so much of a dog in the LDL fight. If you listen to his prior talks, his interviews, it's hard to actually kind of tell where he's at. Um, for good reason, because he really does like to just go off the data he has in hand. So more recently, even before our data were coming in, both himself and Karam Nassir were very upfront about a lot of this recent data as shows the association of CAC and what's known as the power of zero. Karam speaks about it all the time online, which is that if you have a zero CAC, that's a coronary artery calcification scan for, I'm sure you probably talked to your listeners about it, but I'm more bullish on it than I've ever been. It's not quite as good as a CT angiogram, which can also see soft plaque as well, but it's strikingly correlative, more so than I thought it was. And one of the biggest studies that really shifted my opinion much more so in that direction was out of Denmark, and it had 23,000 symptomatic patients. So to kind of set this up for you a little bit, because they've got a socialized healthcare system there, which is great for science. Basically, everybody who got referred to get a CT angiogram between 2008 and 2017 in Denmark, all of them, they ran this analysis between how much the CT angiogram data matched the calcification data and how much that also was impacted by the lipid data. How much did, for example, high LDL associate with cardiovascular disease outcomes? And if you had an LDL of 190 or higher, but you had a CAC of 0, it was not very predictive at all compared to virtually any other level, right? Now, I will caveat, and I'm sure they would want me to caveat as well. If you did have a positive CAC, situation changes. And so folks like Matt Budoff and Karam Nassir would say, oh, but if you do have disease, then you should be taking steps on it. But if you're a patient that's already kind of pushing back, and I've straight up asked them both, is there if I just relay what you have said, including in these presentations, that's their opinion. But that is a controversial opinion by like a lot of people in the lipid side of the fence that would say you should never have a high LDL under any circumstances. Even saying, hey, I have a high LDL, now I'm going to go get a CAC. Oh, the CAC is 0. Is that good enough for you, doctor? Again, they wouldn't say, well, that's the end of the road. They would probably say, okay, but let's, do another scan in like 5 years, something along those lines. But that still is important because it shows how the data that they themselves worked on and that they've helped to assemble, and that they're further influenced by with these other papers, that has informed their opinion, which is data driven in that respect. And so that's exactly who I kind of want as, the principal investigator for our study, somebody who I feel like is going to go where the data takes them.
Perfect. Yeah, I could tell as he was talking, like he wasn't against low carbohydrate diets. He was definitely reading the room and knew who he was talking to, but you could tell he wasn't, a low carb guy. So, okay, I find that all very interesting. Fast forward, another special place, special room, Low Carb Denver 2023. Dave Feldman gets up on the stage with preliminary data, a starting point of where this study is going to start from. Who cares about a starting point? It's preliminary data. It's not going to show anything. You don't even know how the numbers change the very next day. Dave, that was incredible. Did you hear the gasp of 1,000 people all at once when you revealed what the preliminary data showed?
Yeah, it's this is one of those. It's funny because as best as I can, I want to be an instrument of research. Obviously, whatever I'm working on, if it's a matter of research, it's something I can appreciate when we're finding out a group that's otherwise thought to be at a population level at extremely high risk, that they may, at a population level, may not be at extremely high risk, right? I say that with all of the appropriate caveats. This is preliminary, which I said there on the stage, preliminary, preliminary, preliminary. But I said this at the beginning of the study at my announcement of it at Low Carb Denver 2 years earlier. Or sorry, at Low Carb USA 2 years earlier. As I said, look, our study will do a decent job at providing strong data on the big magnitude question, which is why I shared in Low Carb Denver 2023. The big magnitude question, right? So the big magnitude question, and I said this then, scenario 1 is Dr. Budoff at some point in time calls me and says, we've got too many people showing up with advanced plaque. Sorry to tell you this, but your LMHR study is proving the lipid hypothesis at a population level. This group is clearly at enormous risk, right? That was always a possibility. Okay, now that we're done with the 100 scans and we're looking at it, I've already poured over a lot of this data before. It was such a cathartic moment that I wanted to show you guys images that came from the footage captured and get you in the room with me to get that, oh my God, this was not at least the high magnitude of effect that would be predicted by the lipid hypothesis. I want to give due to the people who are like, oh, I still think that there's a risk associated with it, but maybe it's suboptimal, right? So for example, they may argue our participants may in fact prove to be at low risk, but they would be at even lower risk if they had their LDL lower. I conceded that point even before we did our first scan. But what people aren't realizing is how radically different, what a completely different landscape we're in already, that's even a concession. Because if we could go back in time, like 8 years ago, and I could walk into that, that bar at a lipidology conference. I'll bet I could have laid down some fairly serious money for a bet that the averages I just reported to you guys, the LDL of 260 to 272 average with a mostly male cohort at an average age of 55 for almost half a decade at these levels, like it almost certainly would have shown a higher magnitude of risk given the amount of time that's passed and especially being at middle age. Now, one more thing. As I said then, and as I'll say now, it is longitudinal data. So we're getting the first scans, then we're getting the second. And I do want to manage expectations appropriately. Any group like the one I mentioned, even if they are lower risk than expected at baseline, any group at that age range, being mostly male, it's probably going to see an increase in plaque at a population level. It's just we're starting much lower than what the lipid hypothesis would have anticipated, given everything I know to this point in time. There's a let me just fit this last point in. There's something called cholesterol years. It's like pack years, sometimes called milligram years, right? And it's actually a great way to illustrate. It's a great heuristic to illustrate this exposure, dose exposure over time. And that the higher amount it is, the more you can just add it to the total. My own is probably around 7,500, which is around 2,500 more than what they say is the line we're supposed to avoid. And it happens to be close to the average of our cohort in our group. It's close to around 7,500, right? But after that Denver, as you know, that Denver 2023 conference, we eventually had Budov's talk on the match analysis.
Yes.
And the match analysis, we're looking at that same group we just talked about, but now we're comparing it to another group called Miami Heart that's matched for age, ethnicity, all these other factors. And they did not have an average of an LDL of 272. They had an average of 123. But they actually had statistically no difference in plaque than our baseline scans for our group. And we actually were trending toward better. They actually had more overall plaque than we did. And again, I throw in the caveat, A, preliminary, B, I don't want to say ours is doing better because statistically significant difference. There's a lack of statistically significant difference. It's just that I do know that if our group was trending higher, probably it'd be assumed that, okay, our group is lower risk, but they're breaking away. They're eventually going to build into the statistically significant territory. So yeah, I want to be able to say it's good news so far without saying, and therefore we can stop. We can all, this is the end of the line. It's encouraging so far, with all of the appropriate caveats.
Yeah. And it was a really amazing moment. That's literally just the gasp of everybody in the audience. I mean, I'm probably not going to say this as carefully as I need to, so stop me if I don't get this right. But you've got a group of people, 100 people. They have been at a very high cholesterol level, presumably for a really long time. So we're thinking that the milligram years, I believe you called it, or like area under the curve. If you have high cholesterol for a short amount of time, that's not a very big area under curve. If you have low cholesterol for a longer amount of time, that's also not a very area. These are people that for a long time have had a very high level of cholesterol in that population where we would expect them to start experiencing events, heart attacks, whatever it may be, and showed that the level of calcification in their arteries using a very sophisticated test, it was incredibly low. It was so low just at that baseline. I think a lot of us were hoping for good results and thought we might see something nice, but that level was off the charts, off the charts.
Yeah, it would. So my research partners, and this would include Dr. Budoff, would say it wasn't a long time, in that it would be like 4.5 to almost 5 years. For me, it was long enough to appreciate how I could then look at it against the magnitude question. That's why I keep calling it the magnitude question, right? If you're, I'm comfortable giving detractors their due over and over again on the suboptimal question that ours is not going to be a good study to answer the small granular difference question, particularly when we don't have a control group that has longitudinal data. The match control with Miami Heart at least gives us a snapshot with cross-sectional. That was a huge deal to me. In fact, I think I stated this in at Denver. My own excitement level kind of shifted because I'm actually being able to compare it with another group was a huge deal to me, because being able to compare the scans to themselves, that's great. But the thing is, I already know that our group is probably going to look better than any other longitudinal study that's already been done. But detractors would have a point if they were to say, yeah, but you've only done studies on, there's only ever been longitudinal studies done on high risk groups. To which I would say, by the way, that's a big problem with science, period. I'm really so vocal about this. We really have to just invest more of our own money, public money, into doing research on healthy populations. So we have a built-in control for everybody. Anyway, I get on my soapbox about this. It's silly to me that we keep extrapolating from populations that are compromised to then come up with what are supposed to be our normal levels. Like that's just ridiculous. Anyway, but yes, past the cross-sectional comparison, we'll be able to have the longitudinal. That one is getting worked on right now. Again, I don't know the full data until the breakout's done, but I do want to caution everyone to be mindful that it's almost certainly going to be an increase. Or to put it another way, give me any population that's average age 55 and mostly male that's not going to have plaque A and B, that's not going to have any increase of plaque at a population level. The question is back to magnitude. Is it a big magnitude or a small one? And unfortunately, without having a healthy control that also has longitudinal data, we only have that cross-sectional. But we will potentially get another cross-sectional with the second set of scans with Miami Heart. That part's getting worked out right now. But yeah, I mean, look, you still have to go one step at a time. I already know what the math says. The math says if you go by the lipid hypothesis as stated, then we should be seeing the Brown and Goldstein effect with our cohort, because their LDL, their cholesterol years well exceed those of what Brown and Goldstein were looking at in the 70s. And this includes also the children that I've seen, homozygous FH children in the recent study against their cholesterol years. I've done the math on that one as well. So we're into some very different territory now.
It's phenomenal. I was really just about to ask you if you could reveal the 1 year data here on Boundless Body Radio. Breaking news. You have it all ready for us. You heard it here first. That's not going to happen today. I understand. Too bad.
Yeah, it's not just that. We want for all the major releases on the published data to be announced by Dr. Budoff. He is the principal investigator. It's ideally him or potentially like Ned Karam Nassir or somebody high up in that level, because again, it gets back to the importance of it coming from someone like them.
Yeah. Well, it's very exciting stuff. We'll continue to wait for that data. Again, we want to make sure we're managing expectations. Like you said, any population that's aging should have more of those plaque buildups and things that we can observe. So it's just really interesting research, and just the way that it started was absolutely phenomenal. And I love that you have other ways of getting this information out. Not only are you very active with your website and with Twitter and trying to push this message forward, but you're also, and at the conferences as well, but you're also doing this documentary, which we got to see, I think it was an 8-minute preview of at the conference, which was really, really good. Again, I'm really great friends with Robin and Matt. You were able to go over to their house and spend some time. I just talked to Matt about how special that was for him to be able to see you and have dinner with you and hang out and get that footage. Tell us what you can tell us about this documentary and what your hopes are for this.
Yeah, exactly what you said. A lot of this is just getting the message out. I want to say this delicately. Let's just say this research isn't exactly being welcomed with open arms, I guess you could say, in the scientific community. And I don't want to suggest that there's a grand conspiracy so much as there's just kind of a, let's just say there's a direction the wind is blowing, and we know we're kind of working against that, right? But that said, I'm just extremely thankful to have Jen Eisenhart, who's heading up this this whole project, and we started filming, which included, as you noted, Low Carb Denver 2023. That was one of the first things, and I'm so glad we caught it on film. But it's also caught a whole bunch of story beats, including a lot that I've not been able to share. That's going to be really interesting once it can finally be seen on film. And principal photography is nearly close to being wrapped, and then it heads into the edit. The edit's a long process, but it's been pretty exciting. I will say it's that 8-minute clip you're talking about that we got to feature at COSI. You have to understand whatever you might imagine it's like to be filmed for a documentary. I can tell you it's not that. It's whatever I imagined it was going to be. There's a whole lot of filming, there's a whole lot of staging, there's a whole lot of doing stuff, and you get to the point where you're just exhausted all the time because it's always like an extra layer onto the things you're already doing, including, by the way, for the conference. For the conference, I had to, of course, keep turning over the MC role while going and doing two different interviews because that was the one time where we happened to have people there. It was the one time it worked out for the budget, right? But then finally getting to see that teaser piece was super satisfying because it's nice when you're watching something, you're like, oh, I would actually want to see that myself. Like you, it's kind of surreal because you feel kind of removed from what you're watching, even if it's you. And and again, it's hats off to Jen and her team and the editing, the uh, you know, things, just the color grading, things that I noticed from a little bit of filmmaking myself. Just a lot of great work that's been put into it already. And that's just for that little bit. So I'm excited. I can't wait until we finally have it put together.
That's awesome. Yeah, Jen's amazing. She was one of the first people we ever interviewed on this show. And I would say to the listener, if you haven't watched Fat Fiction as you're waiting for this documentary to come out, make sure you go and watch Fat Fiction. And I will make anybody the offer that I made for any of Vinny Tortorich's movies. If you have to pay to rent this movie, you send me a Venmo request and I will reimburse you for watching it. I think it's amazing. Nobody ever takes me up on it, but the offer always stands. If you have to buy Fat 2, Beyond Impossible, or Fat Fiction, I will pay you to watch it. That's it. It was really well done. I would expect nothing less from her, and her company just does such a great job. I'm sure it was very taxing, especially with everything you had going on. I did want to make this point that I thought was interesting. I've noticed in the past that if I'm traveling to one of these conferences, right off the bat, if I meet somebody and they ask me what I'm doing or where I'm going or whatever, Uber driver or Airbnb or whatever, I say, I'm going to KetoCon, nothing. And then the conversation kind of stops there. If I say I'm going to a nutrition conference, might get a question or two or whatever, and that it kind of stops. And I noticed as this one was coming up, people were asking me what I was doing, what the conference was about, and I would say it's called, the Collaborative Science Conference, and it's really about this question, primarily about this question about cholesterol. And people would start to ask me questions, and I would always use the example of Robin in particular, and I would tell people about Robin and say, look, I've got this dear friend I've met at one of these conferences. She's bipolar. She eats a certain way. She's not bipolar, like we said earlier, but her cholesterol goes up. She can reintroduce carbohydrates. Her cholesterol will go right back down to where it's supposed to, but then she's got bipolar. So she's got a very difficult day-to-day decision to make. She spent over a decade pretty much comatose, so she can be medicated again. She could commit suicide because the symptoms are so terrible, or she could go low carb and try to learn about this bet essentially that she's making with her life. And I found that people were super compelled, wanted to share their own stories about cholesterol. I told you we got delayed because of that windstorm in Vegas. I sat in a restaurant bar at Salt Lake Airport. I had an hour-long conversation with people talking about cholesterol and what this was all about. And I started eating more meat and I feel way better. But my doctor wants me to take a statin. And I always want to bring this back to the Robin, the person who this really matters for. And we talk about
Right.
the science and we talk about the numbers and we talk about all of these things. But at the end of the day, it's an individual who's our friend, who we love, who this really matters for. And this is a big, scary question that people need to ask, and there's not good answers, and they need to place really good bets on what they think is going to be best, and it's not that easy. So I wanted to say that, to just say this work is so critically important for so many things, but at the end of the day, I hope all of us can remember on the individual level, this matters a ton.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I've talked about this in interviews before, and I'll probably talk about it in the documentary, but it was kind of a fun, curious thing for me until 2017. Like I'm at the end of 2015, November 27th of 2015 is when I got the first fateful blood test. I remember it like it was yesterday. And December 9th, 2 weeks later, was when I got the second one. The second one was what kicked off the whole curiosity spin. But between that, between I want to say December 9th up until July of 2017, it was kind of fun. It was an effort of curiosity. But in 2017, I didn't just write about lean mass hyperresponders. The last couple paragraphs of that article, I was just speculating, following the logic of the lipid energy model, that this probably applies to children too. Makes sense. They're metabolically healthy, typically, starting out that way. So, there's a decent chance if they're also kind of lean, might see that. But people hadn't been sending me a lot of labs from children until that article came out. It was like it's like a bomb dropped. It was all these different people were like, this is me. This explains me. And then I had a neurosurgeon and his wife reach out to me. And they had a daughter, very young daughter, who was epileptic. And she was thriving on keto. Her seizures were way down. Her energy levels were way up. But the pediatrician pushed back. They were like, these cholesterol levels are unsustainable. You cannot keep her going at these levels. And for me, I mean, granted, I'm not in that same position, but I know enough about seizures that they are brain damage. Like they're not, it's a question of how much, but we don't know how much. We just know that it really is a very serious condition, to the extent to where, yeah, I mean, this is literally the origin of the Charlie Foundation, right? Um, and that's the point where it got really serious for me. So when you bring up Robin, like I when I went and interviewed her for the documentary and I got to meet her family, I couldn't help it. I got a bit emotional because I've had a friend, and in my mind I thought it was like long past. It was just, it'd been a long time since what happened, but he was struggling with bipolar his whole life. And without getting into it, I'll just say it's a tragic story. But it's kind of crazy to me from an truly from an engineering and historical standpoint that there are a lot of things that were thought impossible before, or for that matter, that were thought detrimental. And one thing that keeps getting played out over and over again, and I'm not saying I know for sure this is the case this time, but I can say it's been the case many times over, that aspects of the human body have been thought to be either obsolete or even detrimental. And in the case of something like a rare mutation, that makes sense, sickle cell anemia or things like that. But for something that's conserved for the majority of the population, like, is it really the case that the vast majority of us have, from the starting point, too much cholesterol that's being made, too many ApoB lipoproteins that are being made, such that we need a kind of non-ancestral intervention to bring it down to like really, really low levels, and then we'll only experience benefit? Because I've already said this many times on podcasts, I do think that you will lower your incidence of cardiovascular disease if you bring your LDL levels extremely low. It's just I don't know how much there's a relevance towards a trade-off. I don't know. These are things I'm wanting to explore, and other data avenues outside of these two questions. But if I'm facing something like seizures, if I'm facing something like bipolar, if you don't know, if you don't know, you don't know. If you don't know somebody who's had to struggle with very severe bipolar, and Robin's story is just phenomenal. It's just phenomenal. You'd get why a solution would mean everything. I've talked to a lot of my colleague Siobhan. I've talked to Siobhan about how big of a deal it was for the depression component of, ultimately helping to relieve that from going on low carb and all of the other things on the physical end that she's benefited from in going low carb. She's said plainly, I'd give up all of that over the depression. The depression, you can't know unless you know what it's like to experience that day in and day out. So yeah, yeah, this one thing, of course, we've got to get this data. We've got to find out. And if it's true, if there's folks like Nick Norwitz able to work with his ulcerative colitis and be on this diet and yet maintain LDL at these scary, crazy high levels, but not be at the increased risk, my gosh, I really want to get that data as soon as possible so that he can know, so that I can know.
Wow. Well, we've hosted Robin on the show and got her to tell her amazing story and encourage anybody to go check that out. But recently I was able to interview Matt and hear his story. He's a little bit more shy, doesn't do a lot of podcast appearances, but I got to ask him that question. Like, it's one thing if you live a certain lifestyle, you have your certain data on yourself. You do whatever you like. It's your life, it's your risk, but this is your person. This is the one person you love more than anybody else. And what do you think about writing this line, making this decision with her? And he said, regardless of what she chooses, I'm there. I'm ride or die. I'll be with her. It's fine. She can do whatever she wants. But I will say I would not trade one single day of what our relationship is like right now and the joy and awesomeness and presence that I get to experience versus what it was like before when she was either asleep, medicated, or going to pick up the kids, and that was like all she could really manage. So again, just to bring that human element in, I think is why this is such a compelling story and why it really truly matters as much as it does.
Yeah, it's worth repeating that cholesterol is the most famous biological molecule by far. And of course, I understand if you're already if you're already working toward research that is potentially going to be providing data that 99% of the medical professionals and researchers out there, if it's counter to that expectation, then of course, like I said, it's going to be facing an enormous amount of scrutiny. But I'll just fit in this last little bit because it's fun to bring this up with my engineering friends. Is I have some that have been following my journey this whole time, and so whenever somebody says something like, "Yeah, you realize you don't have any credentials for this, Dave. You're not at all qualified to be doing this." They're usually the ones who are slacking me or they're sending something in the group chat and they're like, they really don't know engineers. Engineers, like you go to whatever big engineer you know who's working on something and be like, yeah, you're not qualified to do this thing that you're working on. Engineers, that's like a rallying call. You're basically challenging them to see if they can prove you wrong because you feel that confident in what it is that you're saying they can't do. Um, that's the story of engineers in general. That's why they tend to be so bullheaded about doing things their way. Um, so yeah. And now we're getting there. We're getting there to where we're actually getting this data. We're finally collecting it.
That's amazing. Wow. Okay. One last thing I just have to touch on with you. Eating a low carbohydrate diet, I feel pretty good and happy most of the time. And so every now and again, I like to, go back to the other side and get really upset and angry. And I always go to one of my least favorite podcasts ever done, ever that I've ever listened to. It features you as an appearance on the Peter Attia podcast. Nothing against Peter Attia. I love the dude. I respect the guy. You've got differences of opinion on the drive. And ironically, he also hosted my absolute favorite episode of all time that I've ever heard, which is his episode with Dr. Sarah Hallberg, which is
Yeah.
just amazing. The episode that was done with you, I thought was completely unfair as he's again, I hate to do this, but like the condescension and the way he was talking with you, especially as that conversation was winding down, I thought was so unmerited. He kept saying, "You're hanging out with the wrong crowd. You need to hang out with the right people. You're playing, you know, twiddly sticks on Twitter with all these guys. Like, you need to go to these right conferences." And you said something like, "Well, these conferences cost a lot of money to go to." And he interrupted you, cut you off, and said, "Well, the low carbohydrate community should fund you to go. If they cared about these answers, they should pay for your way to go to some of these conferences." And I'm very happy to say that this community has stepped up and shown with their dollars that they are very much willing to pay money to get answers to some of these things. I had to throw that in there. I'm so proud and happy of people in the community to step up and to help you and others who are genuine citizen scientists seeking truth and doing this great work out there. Makes me super proud.
Yeah, amen. I cannot express enough things because think about it. When we were having that podcast, this was in 2018, and to go to an NLA conference, it was like $1,000. And to Peter's credit, he was all ready to make good on that promise because at the time I didn't have a lot of I was being very mindful of how much money I was going to spend, but on top of that, it was the ROI. Okay, if I go to this conference, what can I expect to get? Right. And I'll have you know that I did end up going to the conference that he was willing to pay for that was like coming up next, but I realized I couldn't take his money anyway. Because let's say that I had gone, and let's say that I did have an experience that swayed me a little bit more in his direction, it might look to others like that was the reason, was because he paid for it. So I didn't want to be connected to somebody's goodwill, and I credit him for that. It's interesting. I have a donor who we're kind of negotiating a little bit. He's talking very seriously. He'd like me to do a reaction, like a revisiting of that podcast. And so there's a chance I might at some point like re-listen to it because it would be interesting to see it in the current context because that was one of the things we were speculating on at that time. But getting back to the support component, yeah, I would rather the low carb community not pay for me going to an NLA conference in the first place. I love that we're raising money specifically to get the data itself, to literally go and get that data. You want to know, I've got one more thing to brag about with our community and with particularly our participants. They told me up front, you've got to be mindful that you're still going to have probably a 15 to 20% drop off of participants. That's just typical of all studies, right? And I remember thinking at the time, I was like, dang it, I really wanted to get to 100 though. I specifically want 100 participants. So even one participant dropping out, I should have tried to make it something more like 110 or 120. And man, am I excited to tell you, we didn't have a single participant drop out. Not one of the 100. I'm not talking one of 10. I'm talking of 100 participants. All of them got their second scans. All of them flew it the first time for their first scans. They all got their second scans. And I can never state enough. That's how serious this citizen science movement is. So yeah, I love I love to what degree I can help move this along, but this has many authors to it. And I can never thank enough people enough times for the money, for the sweat equity, for everything that they've done to buy in, including COSI. COSI it was really cathartic for us. And again, it made me realize that it's not just about the material means that I just talked about. It's also feeling like we can help to drive each other to move this thing forward. And yeah, it's great. You hear the term grassroots all the time. It's used so like loosely. This is the real thing. This is grassroots. This is the wind is not blowing behind us, right? We have to assemble in the way that we are to make this thing happen. And yeah, props to the community that really is pulling that weight.
Amazing. Special stuff, man. Dave, you've been incredibly kind with your time. Just so grateful for you and all of your research, and to be able to put on the conference was incredible. All the what this research is going to mean down the road. It's curious to kind of think about what the implications could be, and we're not there yet, but it's cool. It's cool to think about. So, man, it's such an honor to host you on the show. Tell people where they can go to find you and connect with you and your work.
Yeah, of course, I'm very active on Twitter/X, Real Dave Feldman. That's also my socials for Instagram and for YouTube. But obviously, I'm going to throw in the plug for the citizensciencefoundation.org. We are a bona fide 501c3 public charity, so your donation is in fact tax deductible. And of course, thank you for your support. COSI was to raise the money for the sister study. We still have a ways more to go. So again, thank you so much for your donation. And by the way, it's getting matched right now. We have an anonymous donor that came forward, so your dollar counts for two, for each dollar that you and again, I just want to make one other pitch. It literally is a 0% admin overhead. I think we ran the numbers. I think only 5.67% is taken out. It's only for third-party services like credit card processing, like with DonorBox and with Stripe. But we literally take nothing at all. It just goes straight. It's like a tunnel that goes straight towards the research. So, yeah, hope you don't mind making the extra plug. And of course, you can check out Own Your Labs. Own Your Labs is our blood testing service where you can order privately, and a portion of the proceeds go to Citizen Science Foundation as well.
Yeah, we didn't even get to talk about that at all, but the way you've been able to kind of subsidize that cost for people is just remarkable, and that those numbers can be used for research down the road is pretty cool. So, Dave Feldman, again, thank you so very much for all the work you're doing, and thank you for taking the time out of your very busy life to come on our show today. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Casey.
Absolutely. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.